Good morning. Afternoon if you're in Europe. Thanks for joining us today. I'm George Frampton, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion about two important areas in which Norway has become a global leader in climate change policy: electrification of transport and global forest preservation. Our goal today is to focus on what we can learn from Norway's pioneering work in these two areas. In the case of electric cars, how do you create a real robust market so that much of the population actually wants to buy these vehicles, as they obviously do in Norway? And in forest preservation, the potentially powerful new LEAF coalition, lowering emissions by accelerating financing, LEAF, L-E-A-F, announced during the Biden Climate Summit by Norway, the UK, the US, and leading corporations to try to really, for the first time, finance forest preservation at a global scale. So what are the challenges it faces? Before we get started, a little housekeeping. This event is on the record. We're live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about this discussion and share it on social media using the hashtag ACEnergy, tagging us at AC Global Energy. Those participating on Zoom today can submit questions in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We're pleased to be joined this morning by the Norwegian ambassador to the United States, Anakin Crookness, distinguished diplomat with 28 years in the Norwegian Foreign Service, deep expertise in national security affairs. She was a former ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic affairs, ambassador to the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and now the first woman to be Norway's ambassador to the United States. Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for helping us put this program together and for being with us today, and I will go over to you.
Thank you very much, George, for that introduction. And good morning to everyone, and good afternoon to my transatlantic friends. First of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this event. This is a very good opportunity to learn from each other. And we will, as George said, today take a close look at two of Norway's proposed responses to climate change: electrification of transport and the forest preservation. But I like to start out with a broader perspective. In Norway, we have been looking for ways to counter climate change for years. And of course, we are very happy to share what we have learned, and that's what we're trying to do here today. Earlier this year, President Biden invited Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg to speak at his climate summit. And the summit brought together heads of states from around the world, researchers, mayors, companies, organizations, all those who have to work together to do something for the climate. And the summit reinforced something we already know. Around the world, new ways of thinking and new technologies are being developed to slow the global climate change. The summit provided the opportunity for all countries of the world to learn from each other and to find inspiration. For example, the United States and Canada talked about the launch of the Greening Government Initiative, making the first international meeting on plans for sustainable government. Green public procurement is vital because the public sector is such a big buyer of goods and services. Since the summit, Norway has joined the Greening Government Network, and we look forward to working with many other countries to help reduce the size of our government's carbon footprint. Also at that summit, Indonesia discussed its mangrove rehabilitation program, as well as a presidential decree that puts a permanent freeze on new licenses for logging and pig farming. And several ministers presented ideas for clean fuels, such as hydrogen, offshore wind, and geothermal energy. Energy storage, clean desalination, carbon capture, advanced mobility, and sustainable urban design were just a few of many examples from the Biden summit. No one can find the perfect solution on their own. We depend on working together and learning from each other. Climate change affects all parts of society, and the task ahead of us is big, but the summit showed us that there are multiple, fully workable paths out of the climate crisis. In that respect, I think the summit was encouraging. Norway has pledged to cut emissions at least in half by 2030. We recently issued a plan to achieve this ambitious goal. It involves all sectors of society: agriculture, industry, transportation, and waste. One of the most important measures is an increase in the price of carbon. By 2030, the tax on CO2 will triple to well over $200 per ton. But we're not just raising taxes. Taxes are not the answer to everything. We're also rethinking our entire fleet of vehicles, both on land and at sea. And later this morning, we will hear more about the electric vehicles. We will learn that more than half of all new cars sold in Norway are electric. And I will admit, I did buy an electric car this last year. I had to renew my 9-year-old Tesla. So I've been driving electric for 9 years. In addition to the cars, we aim to electrify the shipping industry. Zero-emission shipping is growing rapidly in Norway. The number of zero-emission ships in operation in our waters is growing year by year. The types of ships and operations that can use zero-emission technology is expanding. Batteries, hydrogen, ammonia, and biofuels are being introduced. And there's an impressive amount of research and development going on, including at the Norwegian shipyards. Our ship owners who operate around the globe, and we actually have one of the biggest fleets of the world, have agreed to order nothing but zero-emission ships starting in 2030. And that is a really bold target. And we are already switching our ferries, domestic ferries, to electric. Soon, every third ferry in Norway will be electric. More to come. And we have a lot of fjords. We have the longest coastline of any European country, and that means a lot of ferries. So this is a big deal for us. The shift has taken place because the government aims to cut emissions from domestic shipping and fishing in half by 2030. So there are requirements, but also incentives and financial support to help that we get there. And this is the combination we use, the carrot and the stick, as we say. And the same process will need to be carried out on a global scale through the International Maritime Organization. Norway actively supports the ongoing process there to develop further energy efficiency. When we talk about energy, it is not just how we use the power, but also how we generate it that can have a major effect on climate change. In Norway, Equinor and partners are building high wind Tampen project. That is a windmill project. And they will supply oil and gas installations with renewable wind energy. This will be the world's largest floating offshore wind park. One of the good things is that we have a lot of experience and competence on offshore installations because of the oil and gas sector, and we are now taking that technology into the new renewable sector. The project is made possible by strong climate policies, such as the CO2 tax, being a part of the European emission system, but also strong financial support from the state-owned enterprise Enova. Norway is also a long-standing supporter of carbon capture and storage. And last year, the Norwegian government launched Longship. Longship is a nice name. It is the name of the long ship that the Vikings used to use, a really state-of-the-art high-tech at their time. And this new Longship is a massive CCS project, which will be the biggest ever climate project in Norwegian history. And the project captures CO2, transports it by ship to a terminal on Norway's west coast, and stores it deep underground in reservoirs on the continental shelf. What makes Longship special and different from other carbon capture projects is the source of the CO2, because this project will focus on capturing CO2 from a cement factory. Globally, cement industry emits about 7% of all emissions, all global emissions. So this is a huge sector. And carbon capture is widely considered a viable technology to decarbonize the cement industry. Deforestation is one of the subjects that you will look into later today. So I will just say that we have to stop deforestation. And one of the things we do, in addition to LEAF was mentioned, which is of course hugely important, that initiative. What we also do is that we are providing high resolution satellite imagery of all tropical forests. But you will learn more about that later. Finally, just a few sentences about the ocean and the importance of the ocean in solving climate problem. Prime Minister Solberg spearheaded the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, along with 13 other heads of state. They delivered a report a few months ago with a lot of recommendations, and they identified several actions that must be taken to protect and restore marine and coastal ecosystem. Putting sustainability at the heart of ocean management is essential for protection, production, and prosperity that benefits people, nature, and economy. And one of the ocean panel's most important recommendations was to set a goal of 100%. That is fully sustainable management of ocean areas within national jurisdiction by 2025. So that is only 4 years to go. And to support a global target to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. Summing up, the climate, the environment, this earth, they belong to all of us together. And together, we must find the measures that work, the measures that reduce emissions and that can be used at all levels, by nations, by local communities, by companies, and by each and every one of us privately. Learning what works requires research and development, and it requires that we all communicate and learn from each other. Today's event, so graciously hosted by the Atlantic Council, is a perfect example of how we can work together. I look forward to working further with you, and I wish you a very good exchange of ideas today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for setting the stage for this conversation today. Turning first to EVs, it's my pleasure to introduce Christina Bø, Secretary General of the Norwegian Association for Electric Vehicle Owners, to talk about Norway's experience with electric cars, and Dr. David Rapson, Director of the Davis Energy Economics Program at the University of California, Davis, to make some observations about the implications for the US and Canada. Christina, the percentage of new cars purchased in Norway last year was probably the largest in any country in the world. How did that happen?
Well, I'll try to talk, explain it, but I don't know if the answer can be very short. Let's just say quickly who I am. I'm Christina, and I head, as George was saying, the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association. We organize more than 90,000 EV drivers in Norway. So I want to share some numbers with you. The market share so far this year for new passenger cars is 55%. Plug-in hybrids is 27%. So Norwegians is less and less buying petrol and diesel engine cars. What is interesting with these graphs, however, is how fast this development has happened. The EV share back in 2012 was 3%. And 8 years later, it's 55. And Norway did this with a technology that wasn't even mature at all, with low range cars and a lack of chargers. So I believe that this can happen faster in the years to come in other countries. Yeah, and I included the light commercial vehicles here as well. Full electric is at 20%, a little bit slower, but it's quickly increasing now because of more cars to buy to choose from. Currently, about 385,000 fully electric cars on the road, plus about 160,000 plug-in hybrids. We have about 3 million cars on the road in Norway. So this makes up, when you look at the full electric ones, now 13.2% of the total fleet nationally. But of course, in a city like Oslo, it's way above 20% now. So electric cars are very visible in Norway. Just thought I also include this figure showing the topmost selling EVs in Norway this year. In total, I think it's about 55 different full electric car models that have been sold in Norway so far this year. So it's a lot to choose from. We are a bit of in a lucky position compared to many other countries because the car manufacturers want to sell their cars here because it's a competitive market and interesting to be here. And as you can see, it's a few American car brands here as well. Tesla has been high on this list for years, but it's also cool to now see the Ford making the list with the Mach-E, which have become quickly very popular. We have a target of 100% market share already from 2025, less than 4 years from now. And we have a way to go because it includes both passenger cars and light commercial vehicles. But it is possible, and we are on our way to reach this target. One of the challenges, of course, is charging infrastructure. And this is the reason why a transition takes a bit of time. You can't go from 1 year and having no chargers and then to the second and all the chargers are there. That's why we need to quickly increase the number of EVs on the road and especially focus on new car sales. And then the charging infrastructure will follow. We currently have about 3,500 fast chargers or high power chargers in Norway, and the network is growing quickly, about 10 different operators. So now it's a very competitive market and hardly any sort of incentives or any subsidies to get this built. It's a commercial market. And as you can see, the share, if you look at fast chargers per EV, is getting better and better. Today, it's about 107 or so fully electric cars per fast charger. A few years ago, of course, the situation was pretty bad, although we didn't have that many EVs. And I myself remember when I started working at the Eevee Association in 2014, I couldn't even go on the motorway an hour south from Oslo and visit my parents. There were no charger on that distance. So it changes really quickly. At the end, I just wanted to say a bit sort of globally, it's a paradigm shift that we are facing. The world EV stock now is at 8.6 million, and it increased with 3 million last year. So we are at the beginning of a S-curve globally. And I think most people still don't understand how quickly this is going to happen and how many signs that shows us that this now is happening because the big money is moving in this direction. And being in Norway, I think people understand this, but in areas, in countries where there's still a low penetration of EVs, you might find it difficult to believe in. And the same was the situation in Norway 5 years back. But now this has become the new normal. These are some of the changes that are happening. It's a very quickly development of new technology, longer range cars, faster charging, and so on. And the big OEMs, the car manufacturers, are now more and more on this, fully focusing on electric cars. You saw it first maybe with the Chinese car manufacturers. We have several Chinese brands now in Norway. It was not the situation 2 years ago, completely changed. And of course, the European and the American OEMs really have to step up. And batteries industry, especially in Europe now, a lot of investments in battery industry and in Norway as well. And the sales in Europe, EV sales doubled the last year with new restrictions. So policies help. And of course, in the US, it's a lot of positive signals now with Biden in office. It was fun to see how immediately after you saw that GM, Ford, and the American OEMs, car manufacturers, suddenly seemed to change completely focus. I think almost they were waiting for it and a bit happy that he was saying straight out that this is what's going to happen now. So it's my last slide. I think it's also important to stress that being at the forefront of this development in Norway has also created really great opportunities. We have a lot of new industry now being established. I was just here focusing on battery industry, but there are 4 different battery cell factories being planned in Norway at the moment. And a big recycling plant, Hydrovolt, that is going to recycle batteries for all of Europe, and so on and so on. I mean, I could go on, but this, of course, is incredibly important for Norway, which has so many jobs in connection to oil production, that we can now shift also and get new jobs with new industry. And I think that is probably my most important message to the US. You should embrace this development as fast as possible because it creates great opportunities as well. Thank you.
Christina, thank you very much. Creating the battery supply chain is particularly impressive. Now to David, you've been studying both the economics and the psychology of electric car markets now for almost close to a decade. How could the US do what Norway is doing? Can we get people to buy EVs at this kind of pace?
Thanks, George. So these were really fascinating comments by the ambassador and by Christina. And I do believe that there's a lot that we can and should learn from Norway, both in the United States and Canada and in the rest of the world. And I want to just highlight that there are 2 major components to this electrification vision that we're embarking on, and that Norway is significantly ahead of anybody else in the world on. The first is the transition to a reliable, clean electric grid. This is an essential component of success when it comes to electrification, because if what we're doing is shifting vehicles away from gasoline and towards coal, that really is not helping solve the problem that we all are trying to solve. And this distinction is very important, actually, when we think about Norway versus the rest of the world, because Norway's electric grid is already 98% renewable because of the incredible endowment in hydroelectric energy that they have, which is fantastic. The second component to the transition is Eevee adoption. Is this a technology that consumers are going to want to adopt? And I think what we've seen in Norway is absolutely, if you provide enough incentives, then consumers are going to buy EVs, and that in a sense, both of these are very encouraging to see that there is a country like Norway that can make this happen. But I want to put a little bit of caution into this conversation as it relates to the US and Canada, and especially the rest of the world, the developing world in particular. So in a sense, in this conversation, we're thinking about how Norway can be used as a model for North America, but it's also very important in the climate change debate for Norway and North America and the OECD to be a model for developing countries, because one of the incredible things of our time is the pulling of poor countries out of poverty. And this is linked to energy demand, which currently is being served by fossil fuels. So this is just a kind of a long way of saying whatever it is that we do in the Western wealthy world to deal with our own climate change aspirations, we want it also to be replicable by the developing world. And if we fail to make that final link, then we're still going to have problems around carbon emissions long into the future. So, right now I'm a professor at University of California, but I'm sitting in my hometown of Halifax, Nova Scotia, up on the other side of the continent. And I think this is a great example of what I'm trying to get across here, which is in Nova Scotia, we have an electric grid that's about 2/3 coal generation. Now, people are very concerned about climate change up here, but it's very difficult to make the transition in Nova Scotia away from coal and towards a renewable grid. The bridge fuel of natural gas is both unpopular among environmentalists and difficult to implement because of supply here. And yet the government is subsidizing electric vehicles here. And I think that is kind of putting the cart before the horse. Until there's a clean grid, there's really not the benefit that people would like from switching to electric vehicles. And I think that as we consider Norway as a model for the world, we have to think about, well, how clean is the grid where we're creating massive incentives for EV adoption before we actually implement them. In the world, the grid is over 60% fossil generation. So this is a very important point. So I think one of the ways to think about this in terms of policy, and just looping this back to Norway as an example, is the question of, should we be incentivizing EV adoption via carrots or via sticks? And one of the things that I really love about the Norway example is it's mostly, or there is a huge stick associated with gasoline car purchases. There are big taxes and fees in Norway that are waived for people who adopt EVs. So this is a huge financial incentive, but not in the form of subsidizing EVs. It's waiving the taxes and fees on gasoline cars. And if I could suggest one thing that the US should adopt from the Norway model, it is moving away from the carrot model and towards the stick model. We have to make it more expensive to pollute. And that's going to create a lot of headroom for technologies like EVs, but it's also technology neutral, because we're not just thinking about what's going on today. We want to create a policy environment that is suitable for new technologies that arise in the future, new information that arises in the future. And, maybe we're going to be at 100% electric vehicles in 2035 or 2050, but I think it's going to be significantly more complicated than that. And creating the right incentive structure, a technology neutral incentive structure where you make it expensive to pollute, and then allow consumers and firms to figure out the best technologies to fit underneath that framework. I think that's the least risky and most promising way to go if you care about climate change mitigation. So, I think the Norway model is inspiring. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And I think, when it comes to North America, the facts on the ground in terms of the grid composition, and the suitability of going full throttle on EV adoption is a little bit different, significantly different than the facts on the ground in Norway, where there's already a very clean electric grid. So, thank you for including me in this conversation. It's a very important part of climate policy today, and I'm honored to be included.
David, thank you so much. Important caution about the grid, and interesting observation about sticks versus carrots, since in previous administrations, and really most of the Biden administration's plans for EV incentivization focus around carrots and not sticks, and query how well that's worked in the past and how well it can work at scale. Now to forests. We are delighted to have with us Andreas Dahl Jurgensen, who's the Managing Director of Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, to provide some insight into the LEAF initiative, and Chris Drajicek, Acting Branch Chief for Partnerships and Initiatives at the State Department's Global Change Office. She's the department's liaison for this LEAF program. and they'll talk about the challenges to ramping up this important initiative. And then I'm going to ask for a quick comment from Francis Seymour, the board chair of the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions, or ART, A-R-T, which has been adopted as the template of the program. Andreas, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, George, and thanks also to Atlantic Council for having us and the opportunity to exchange thoughts on this. I would also like to say a big thanks to Chris Dragisek and the U.S. administration. This could equally be called U.S. leadership. We're tremendously excited to the renewed and strengthened partnership we have to address tropical forests around the world, both through the LEAF initiative and through others, and of course to Francis, from a long-term collaborator from the World Resources Institute, to join us as well. So just to upfront, since this is a bit of a broad audience, we will not succeed to solve the climate crisis unless we stop and reverse tropical forest loss. We need to do that drastically faster than any effort in the past, and we need a greener planet than we have today. Ironically, we need about 3 billion acres more forests to sustainably feed a growing and more prosperous population with nutritious food in the future. And we need to get there, we need the more rational relationship between humans and land and nature. Of course, deforestation is also about biodiversity, biggest biodiversity source on the planet, and we're losing species every day that we didn't even know existed. NATO and Pentagon already listing deforestation and climate change as a security risk, and so this is something that adds to the reasoning for doing this beyond, of course, the climate impact. And of course, it's tropical forests are home to millions of indigenous communities or peoples and local communities that need forests for their livelihoods and survival. So Norway has been doing this now for about 10 years. We allocated about 10% of our ODA budget to address deforestation, and Parliament has decided with a broad consensus to continue that effort at high levels until 2030. This is, I think, an opportunity to think strategically across everything that needs to be done to address deforestation. So I'll get to the LEAF Coalition, and I think what we think is a unique opportunity that we worked on for a decade. The most important thing we do is to support tropical forest countries to enact reforms and to rationalize the use of land so that they can produce more food, grow their economy, while also protecting forests. On the other hand, we're also working on global efforts in global markets to reduce the pressure on tropical forests from commodity markets. Every time you go to the supermarket, you contribute to deforestation from buying commodities like beef, soy, palm oil, pulp and paper, cocoa, all the things that are in the food we eat every day. So we're spending a lot of effort driving voluntary commitments and accountability to reduce deforestation from tropical commodity supply chains that drive tropical deforestation as well. Every time you invest in a stock portfolio, you're likely to contribute to deforestation as well. So we're also working to get more data and standardized on objective data that portfolio managers can use to screen deforestation risk in their portfolios. These efforts have been with mixed successes in the past. We've had some major breakthroughs, especially on palm oil in Indonesia, but it's really important that we ramp this up. And I see a very positive trend that we're moving away from sort of voluntary action to increasingly focusing on regulations and demand side measures as well. And I know there are discussions on both sides of the Atlantic to address imports on deforestation tainted products. US, of course, building on their history with the Lacey Act that prohibited the imports of illegally produced timber, and the EU now working on regulations and non-regulatory measures to address import deforestation. We're also working on international forest crimes. It's the industry the size of cocaine, or these things are hard to measure, but there are huge illicit industries that undermine democracies and human rights and tax collection and all the efforts of tropical forest countries to address deforestation in their territories. Lastly, before I get to our partnerships with countries, is this initiative that the ambassador mentioned on satellite imagery. I think we've come now to a point where the costs have come down, the quality have improved, and we're now at the point where we can no longer say that we don't know what's happening in the forests, right? So we have seen the US leadership with Landsat and efforts that they have had to provide free satellite imagery to the world in the past. And last year we entered into a public-private partnership with Airbus and Planet Labs based in California, and the Norwegian satellite firm KSAT to provide these high-resolution satellite imagery for free to anyone in the world every month, covering all the tropical forest areas. And this will support all the strategies that I mentioned. It will support forest governments to see what works and the policies they're doing and how they succeed, to monitor deforestation and address illegalities. It will support carbon markets that need to have better data to reduce uncertainties. It will support indigenous peoples that can make governments and companies accountable for intruding on their lands and sort of on their rights. It will support global supply chains companies in these food industries that want to monitor their supply chains and the supply basins, so where they buy commodities from, and of course civil society also to keep companies and governments accountable. So back to the LEAF coalition and the original focus. In the last 10 years, most of our effort has been on piloting essentially what the LEAF coalition could become. We have partnered with tropical forest governments bilaterally with big results-based partnerships as a model to build into the global climate convention and the discussions we've had there. And to promote private sector finance as well to countries that deliver reductions in deforestation. And I'm very happy that we succeeded in the Paris Agreement to make what's called REDD+, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, a critical part of the global response to climate change. What is missing in the Paris Agreement, of course, is the finance. And so I think originally one was hoping that there would be a global carbon market that would be in companies or governments would be in compliance to pay for reduced emissions elsewhere as part of going over and above what they could do at home. And now we're seeing a surge of interest from the private sector that take on voluntary climate commitments to do more and to be part of paying countries for reduced deforestation. So our experience has been primarily through bilateral partnerships, initially with Brazil, that had, I think, the most successful effort to date to address climate change, perhaps in any sector, anywhere, reducing deforestation in the Amazon by 80%. This was a combination of using best-in-class satellite data with a concerted law enforcement effort. They protected indigenous lands and national parks to create a buffer where the arch of deforestation was intruding on the Amazon. They froze credit to municipalities that had high deforestation, and by enforcing the law, they stimulated investments in higher productivity for legal farmers that saw that the impunity was ending and that the cost of entering into the forest was not worth taking, and instead they can invest in profitable investment in their farms. Indonesia has now
Andreas,
repeated.
I'm going to have to ask you to take another minute if you would, and then
absolutely.
So thanks.
So Indonesia has now, to a large extent, repeated Brazil's recipe. Of course, there are national differences, but they have taken bold steps to protect carbon-rich forests and peatlands and enforce the law. And so we're in a bilateral partnership with them also to pay them for reduced emissions at the national level, to co-finance their efforts to do more. And last week we announced an extension of our partnership with Peru, jointly with Germany and the United Kingdom and the United States as an observer, but with a huge program in Peru that is aligned with the spirit of that partnership. That we can do even more there. So these are the sort of the bilateral pilot programs that we see that the LEAF coalition can really help strengthen and scale up. The model is there. We've now come to the agreements in the climate convention. We have better data to measure results. And now we're talking about the need for private finance to come in and scale up those efforts. So if I'm out of time, maybe Chris can briefly run down the LEAF coalition.
Thank you. Chris, a unique thing about this new coalition is that it focuses on agreements with governments, with jurisdictions, rather than individual projects, so that you can guard against leakage. But that's going to take some high prices to get governments to actually cooperate. How can the US help with this? And I note that, yes, thanks.
Sure, and thanks for the question. First, thanks to the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks as always to Norway. Norway has been a key partner in this initiative to protect forests globally for the last decade plus, as Andreas said, and we're thrilled to work with them on LEAF as well as on a whole number of other initiatives. And again, thanks to Francis, who's been a leader in this for longer than I've been involved, and has huge responsibility for any successes we've had. So the Biden administration and Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Kerry, as you probably well know, are very focused on climate change, and particularly focused on the need to increase our global ambition to reach net zero emissions globally by 2050 in order to keep possible a global temperature rise of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the Leader Summit on Climate, as George noted earlier, we had a really ambitious announcement of a new nationally determined contribution, a new climate target of reducing emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. And we announced a whole climate finance package to go with that. Forests are a key part of that. And the reason they're a key part of that is, as Andreas outlined, you can't get to 1.5 degrees without protecting forests. We can't get to where we need to go in terms of the climate without eliminating deforestation in the next decade and without beginning to restore forests and other ecosystems. And we know that. So we're very, very focused on forests. The LEAF Coalition, as Andreas mentioned, is a huge part of that moving forward. So the LEAF Coalition, very, very broadly, brings together governments, at the moment, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and 9 large companies to aggregate our demand for results from forest and climate programs, REDD+ programs, at a national or subnational scale. This opportunity is open to any tropical or subtropical jurisdiction around the world. And we've put out a call for proposals asking these jurisdictions to come forward by the end of July with their proposals. Those proposals will be evaluated against an independent standard, which is called the Arch Tree Standard. And I think Francis will speak to that a little bit more in a moment. And jurisdictions that are found to be eligible based on the proposals can enter into agreement with any LEAF participant by the end of this year. There is a floor price of $10 per ton of verified emissions reductions that's being offered. And private sector participants, as George just asked, may well negotiate higher prices for these. There are a number of different ways that the participants in the countries or subnational entities may choose to engage. So it could be pure results-based payments, but they could also negotiate to transfer title. And in some cases, they may negotiate to conduct what's called a corresponding adjustment, an adjustment to their Paris Agreement accounting to go along with that. One of the reasons we thought this was so important is because it's one of the first times we've been able to mobilize private sector investment at scale for forests around the world. And I think it's important to note that the companies that are engaged in LEAF are not doing this instead of taking ambitious action of their own. So the companies themselves have committed to reducing emissions significantly across their supply chains. They all have science-based targets or the equivalent. They've all committed to publishing their greenhouse gas inventories, to putting out publicly any use of emissions reductions or emissions credits, and to having that independently audited. So the companies have committed to strong action of their own, as have the governments. And this is a way to support additional mitigation around the world. We're really excited about this as a model to help leverage private investment and public action into protecting forests. And I'll just note really quickly, as Andreas also mentioned, for the United States, this is only one part of a much broader forest portfolio. We're very much also looking at other ways to increase the value of standing forests, to help shift investment by the private sector into investments that are more forest friendly and more climate smart. We're looking at ways to ensure that commodity sourcing around the world is consistent with climate strategies and forest protection goals. And we're supporting governments in policy reform and stakeholders in building the capacity that they need to build up economies that are both strong and consistent with our forest and climate goals. So LEAF fits in very nicely to that. We think it's a really good model. We're very excited to see how it develops. There's a lot more interest by companies and other governments in participating. And again, we're hoping to get some very strong proposals by the end of July so that we can sign agreements by the end of this year. So I'll stop there, and I'm always happy to answer questions. But again, very much appreciate this opportunity to talk about something that we're very excited about. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Francis, what do you think are the biggest challenges to not just getting countries to sign up and really make a major change in forest protection policies, but getting the corporate funding necessary to make these work, to get the countries to do the programs?
Thanks, George, and thanks so much for having me at this event. I can't help but remember, and Chris and Andreas will remember, that it was almost exactly 5 years ago that then Secretary of State John Kerry was in Oslo for a conference on tropical deforestation and signed an agreement with the government of Norway to collaborate on this agenda. And so it's great to be picking up where we left off 5 years ago on this agenda. So I think as Andreas and Chris have stressed, the two key features of the LEAF Coalition's approach are, one, to motivate government action to reduce deforestation, because so many of the drivers of deforestation require that we do things that only governments can do, like enforce the law. And the other aspect is to mobilize large-scale finance from the private sector. And both of these are necessary to achieve the challenges that we need to overcome the challenges that are before us. And yet each one comes with its own set of challenges in the transition from the world that we live in now to the one that we envision. So first of all, related to incentivizing government action, many of you may not know that right now, all of the private finance that's flowing to forest protection is in the form of voluntary credits at the project scale. And so to reward governments for their actions at the level of entire countries or large states and provinces requires resolving, well, how are we going to deal with all these projects in aligning accounting and finding a way to incentivize private investment at the scale of individual sites, which we will still need, while rewarding performance at the jurisdictional scale. And I think that this is an area where assistance can be provided to help governments develop the financial intermediary institutions, the good processes to do that hard work domestically to align accounting and provide incentives for communities, private investors, indigenous territories, others to align with that broader system. The second challenge comes from a shift from the public finance of jurisdictional scale action, which Andreas described, to market-based finance for those actions. Right now, or up to now, over the last 10 years, we've lived in a world where public sector donors like Norway have offered a fixed price of $5 a ton, either in bilateral agreements or through multilateral programs such as at the World Bank, to governments for their performance. But the standard that they had to meet was somewhat negotiable and often ended up looking different from one country to another and over time. But to shift to market finance, we need a single high standard so that all of the credits issued by the different governments are fungible, that one from one country is the same as one from another. And that's where the ART-TREE standard comes in to provide a quite prescriptive standard where here's how you have to set your reference level, here's how you have to report on your safeguards implementation and other aspects. And so we've moved from a world where the price was fixed, but the standard was negotiable. And now we're into a world with the LEAF Coalition where the standard is no longer negotiable, but maybe the price is negotiable and buyers may be willing to pay a higher price for those credits with higher standard of quality or additional co-benefits. And I think that everybody in this space, including the governments who are suppliers as well as the private sector buyers, are there's going to be some turbulence in this relationship because there will be some resistance to the high standards that are being requested. Maybe countries will have to redo their reference levels and object to having to do that. There may be some resistance from the private sector to having to pay more for a higher quality of a carbon credit. But these are good problems to have because it shows that we are in fact making progress from a world in which we only had private sector finance to projects, public sector finance to jurisdictions, and moving to private sector finance at the jurisdictional scale that will motivate the kind of government action that we need to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask you, and maybe I'd start with Chris, although Andreas or Francis could answer. When corporations buy these credits, will they largely be used initially in a voluntary offset market? Or is there a hope that at some point they can be useful, integrated into some governmental carbon trading system?
It's a great question. So we noted that the LEAF Coalition was largely established with the voluntary use in mind. But there are a couple different ways that corporates can choose to engage. So one may be through pure results-based payments. And in that case, there is no use of these credits. It's simply a payment per ton of emissions reductions achieved, which is also how governments are participating. The corporates may take title, and again, that would be with voluntary uses in mind. But they do have the option, along with the host country, to elect to do, as I mentioned, corresponding adjustments to the Paris Agreement accounting, which basically means that if a company takes title to a credit and plans to use it, the company or the country does not count that ton towards the achievement of their NDC. And in that case, it could be that there might be compliance purposes for which those tons are eligible. That, of course, would depend on whether the art tree standard is relevant for those compliance purposes.
And it may depend also on what happens with the negotiation of carbon trading rules under the Paris Agreement, right?
So in this case, we do not expect the NDCs, the tons to be used for any nationally determined contribution other than that of the supplier country. So all the governments participating have agreed that we will not use these tons towards our own NDCs. But there might be other things like the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO's carbon market, which could be very relevant in the future.
Let me come back and ask a car question because we have a couple of minutes left to Christina, but then maybe to David. So in Norway, you have a very high carbon tax. You have relieved taxes. You buy an EV, the stick that's taxes on internal combustion cars isn't there. So that there's a stick, there's a high carbon tax, and then you have tailpipe standards. All of those three things, I assume, are driving adoption of EVs. Is there any sense of which are most important? What is it that's most motivating people, the stick, the carbon tax, or the tailpipe standards?
It's actually quite simple. It's all about making new cars compatible. So if a new EV costs a lot more than buying a new petrol diesel engine car, most consumers would make that choice because the upfront cost is high on a new car. So what Norway has managed is, because we have a long tradition of taxing the purchase of new cars, with not taxing EVs, they're actually more or less the new price, the price tag on new cars is actually more or less the same. And that is what will eventually happen globally too, because these cars will be cheaper to manufacture year by year. But to make it happen faster, we need policies. And I know it's often discussed, what about people that can't afford an EV? I know that discussion is very much present in the US. I think that we have to switch it around a little bit and think a bit differently about it. Because in Norway too, it's a certain kind of people. Actually, it's mostly companies that buy new cars. 50% of new car sales in Norway are done by leasing and companies. 8 out of 10 cars that were sold last year were secondhand. But we cannot really start with the secondhand cars. We need to start with the new cars, and those cars should be able to run on renewables, because every new car we sell today will run on the road, at least in Norway, for 18 years to come. So every new petrol or diesel engine car will pollute for 18, 20 years. So we should stop selling new cars that cannot run on renewables. And David, we're also problematizing the fact that in areas you have a lot of coal. I however, think that still, yes, we obviously have to focus on cleaning up the grid. But I don't think we can wait till we have 100% renewable electricity production in the world before we start to introduce EVs or cars that can run on renewables. We have to do the two things as fast as we can if we are to be able to cut emissions in time. So that, I think, is important to remember. We have to focus on both things, but the transition to EVs has to happen as quickly as we can, and it has to happen on the price tag of new vehicles. And people with a certain income buy new vehicles. Therefore, there's no problem putting taxes on new vehicles. It will not hurt people with lower income. So put taxes at least on the cars that pollute the most, and use that money to subsidize zero emission vehicles. And that is something that more and more countries are now doing. And it's really cool to see also in third world countries, this is starting to happen. So that's really cool.
Thank you. We have just 1 minute, I think, but let me come back to David and say the reminder that if you an electric car in the Midwest will not be anywhere near as clean as an electric car in California if the California is not fueling the car with coal power. And David, you just recently authored a paper, I think it's called something like Putting the Brakes on Massive EV Adoption, warning that is there a solution to this though, if we can't go fast enough across the country to do green power, trying to focus electric car adoption in places where it's going to have the maximum climate impact? Is that possible?
Well, this is why I think it's so important to have technology neutral policies like pollution taxes that make it expensive to pollute. You know, if what we're doing is, if there in the United States, for example, was a nationwide EV subsidy, this is going to be good in some sense because there will be adoption of EVs in places like California and the Western grid, which is quite clean. But it's also going to create the wrong incentives, which is to put EVs where there's lots of coal as well. It's not going to do anything to reduce the adoption of EVs in places like the Midwest grid. And, you know, I'm sympathetic to the urgency of this problem that's being expressed here. But, you know, if you put an EV, say, in Nova Scotia or in Chicago, and it's being charged on the margin with coal, for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now, it's actually dirtier than gasoline. And that's just not what we want to do. I don't think that type of policy is going to add to the credibility of the moment. So, you know, subsidies, the last point I want to leave you with is just that subsidies do create incentives that are undesirable. So they're going to, you know, put more cars on the road, which is the opposite of what we want to do. They're going to fail to reduce driving in gasoline cars. We want to reduce driving in gasoline cars. We want to disincentivize driving EVs where there's coal electricity, and subsidies aren't going to do that. We want old gasoline cars to be retired, and subsidizing EVs is not going to accelerate that. In fact, it's going to create scarcity in the used dirty gasoline car market, which means they're going to linger longer. So, you know, all of these reasons, when you think about getting the incentives right, you really come back over and over to the need for a pollution tax, a carbon tax, and that's going to align the incentives of decision makers with the goals of climate change mitigation. So that's where we really need to go.
Thank you. Thank you all for this. I think what the discussions have indicated, we could use a couple of more hours on each of these subjects. So thank you all for the panelists for taking the time to share your perspectives. I also want to thank Kelsey Foran, Emily Burlinghouse, Laura Macedo, Zeynep Wironen, John Berg and John Hansen at the Norwegian Embassy, and the Atlantic Council AV team for their work in organizing this event. If you'd like to rewatch the panel or share the stream with a colleague, you can find a recording on our website and the YouTube channel. And for those of you who were on Zoom, thanks again for joining us and have a great day.